Hello and welcome back to Embracing Data. I'm Marian Vidal-Fernandez and today our guest speaker is Sara Rahman. Today we will be discussing how to embrace data to evaluate policies to reduce crime. Welcome, Sara. How are you?
I'm well, Marian. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Thank you for coming here. Sara is about to take a break from work, actually, in her job as a research manager for the New South Wales Bureau of Crime and Statistics. And she's literally on her way to Boston to complete her master in public policy at Harvard. Congratulations, Sara. Across her previous jobs in BOCSAR, such as an evaluator and a research officer, Sara has contributed to different research papers and reports. These include analyzing the impacts of crime reduction policies on reoffending rate, crime accident rates, as well as examining the gaps in criminal justice outcomes for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people and cybercrime. So, Sara, what makes you interested in using data to evaluate policy?
I started my career at this place called the Australia and New Zealand School of Government. It was a real hub for thinking about public policy and public service and how strong and independent public service contributes towards better outcomes for people, but also kind of strengthens our democracy. And so every day I was kind of exposed to a lot of thought and debate about that. And data and policy evaluation is a really important part of that, because if we don't look at which policies work, then how do we know government is delivering better outcomes for people? And I think if we don't evaluate our programs, then how do people know when, the politicians kind of propose ideas, which ones have more merit than others? Like, I think a lot about some of the essays and thoughts around like utilitarianism, but without data and evidence, we kind of are just debating things based on speculations and differences in our value system. So data and evidence helps us shed light and better inform these debates about what we value in a society. And that's what I find really rewarding about this as a career. And when I came to the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, it is a place that really adheres to these ideals. So the leadership of the Bureau really tries to cultivate this environment that's both academically very rigorous, but also in service of good public outcomes. And so the team uses really cutting edge research methods and really tries to improve data in order to inform public discourse and public policy. So there's something really satisfying about working in government, seeing key issues, the work in the Bureau informing how people think about those issues, but also what people do about them.
Well, that's fascinating. And I think you touch on a point that it's very interesting, which is the difference between policy and politics. There is the difference between what politicians say are going to do, what they actually implement, and the impact that those policies they've chosen to implement has when they decide to implement them. As well as taking into account that our resources are not infinite and we need to make choices. And that you're also interested in trying to make evaluations that are for good in terms of our society. So you've stated that you're passionate about how evaluation and research can transform outcomes for society. Could you name now some specific reports that you've led that really touch on this passion?
I think that government should really focus on those communities that face the biggest disadvantage. In my career, I've been really lucky to have been involved in a few pieces of work that have really touched on this theme. So I was involved in data work with an organization called Just Reinvest New South Wales. What they were looking to do was to redirect money spent on criminal justice on improving other aspects of young people's lives in Burke, New South Wales at the time. My job was to compile data about many indicators of child development, education, health, and criminal justice outcomes for young Aboriginal people in Burke. So what happened is all that data I put together was compiled into this brochure. So on one side, it presented what the criminal justice stats were like for Aboriginal people in Burke. So back then, Burke was known as the town with the highest per capita crime rate in the world. And then on the flip side of this brochure, so it was a physical brochure, on the other side were all the data that I had compiled about the socioeconomic outcomes of these young people, showing really high rates of vulnerabilities in early childhood development, poor outcomes in schools. And so in many ways, it helped illustrate, the other side of the criminal justice journey for these young people. So that was really special to me. More recently, I did a piece of work with my colleague, Adam Tversky, where we looked at some of the gaps in cannabis cautioning for Aboriginal people in New South Wales. A media outlet had used the Bureau's data to show that Aboriginal people were receiving cannabis cautions at a much lower rate than non-Aboriginal people. So cannabis cautions are a way that the police can choose to divert someone from a court case. If they're caught with small quantities of cannabis, they can just choose to caution them rather than proceeding them to court. And so what we did was we looked at our data both descriptively and using some statistical models. And what we found is that the eligibility criteria were responsible for excluding a lot of Aboriginal people. And after we wrote that report, people designing policies in the department became a lot more conscious of how programs' eligibility criteria can really exclude some vulnerable groups. That was special too.
I guess it must be really rewarding to work on topics that help others, especially through policies that can be amended in a way that maybe we're not aware of and that are having perverse consequences for those who actually need more support. So you've worked on several of these areas, such as looking at the challenges that Indigenous people face within the criminal justice system. And you've also looked at analyzing the trends in Indigenous female population. I'd like to talk about another report that you led. This report analyzes a policy to reduce drink driving offenses. And this policy, it's called the New South Wales Mandatory Alcohol Interlock Program. Could you tell me a bit more about this policy and what your question was?
In New South Wales, for many years, drink driving was one of the leading causes of deaths on our roads. And so over time, in seeking to reduce that, quite common that, if you're driving out at night, you'll see police on the side of the roads and they test people for what they've been driving under the influence of alcohol. And that has really helped reduce alcohol-related road tolls. But as a result, we now have huge volumes of drink driving offenses in our court system. Historically, when someone is charged with drink driving, one of the most common penalties is a license disqualification. So someone will have their license disqualified for a particular period of time, could be 3 months or 12 months, and sometimes even longer, depending on their criminal history. And it's been treated as almost this method of incapacitation, getting someone by disqualifying someone from driving altogether, then they can't drink drive, is the theory. And it is somewhat backed by evidence. So there's evidence that it does reduce reoffending to some extent, but you can see how it might not deter some people. If you think about someone who lives in a regional area, they probably need to drive to get around, and there's probably not a whole lot of visible police enforcement at all times. So they might continue to take the risk. But also, just touching on that point, a lot of people in New South Wales commute to work by driving. So when you disqualify someone from driving altogether, you might gain some crime reduction benefits from reduced drink driving, but it might come at a well-being and a social and economic cost to that person. They might face a lot of difficulty, going about their everyday lives, going to work. So interlock devices have become an emerging technology to deal with drink driving. So what they are, they're devices that can be fitted to a car and a car's engine. And so if a car has an interlock device fitted, to start the car, a person must blow into this sort of tube. It does a little breath test on them to see if they've got any alcohol in their system. And if they return a negative breath test, then the engine starts. So, and this is why they've become such a popular technology because for different jurisdictions, because they really deal with that trade-off. We can stop people drink driving without stopping them from driving altogether. They can still drive, provided they haven't had any alcohol. So we gain the crime reduction benefits without necessarily incurring any loss of productivity or well-being from people not driving altogether. How it was implemented in New South Wales was through a mandatory penalty, which came in February 2015. So what that means is that if someone's charged with drink driving, a judge or magistrate must give them an interlock order, which says they must either install the interlock device in their car or they can take a 5-year disqualification. You can also be exempt if you don't have a car. So how this program was implemented in New South Wales was through a mandatory penalty. And what that means is that if someone is charged with drink driving and they're in court, the magistrate or the judge must impose an interlock order, which says they can either install the interlock device in their car or they can take a 5-year disqualification. You can also be exempt if you don't have car, but in which case you're disqualified. And if they choose to install the device, they have to pay the cost of the installation. They have to get the device serviced, and basically every time they drive, they need to blow into it and provide a breath test. The devices are also fitted with several features that make them kind of tamper-proof. So some of them have fingerprint sensors, they have cameras, and if someone's caught trying to breach the conditions of the order, for example, by having a family member blow into the device, they can be caught, and that is also a criminal offense. And this didn't apply to all drink drivers, but it applied to a few groups. So the more serious groups, at least initially, the first time high range drink driving, as we call it, those who refuse breath tests, and those who've committed their second or, repeat mid-range drink driving, as we call it.
So even though the individual has committed a mistake, this interlock policy offers an alternative to losing your license or even going to prison. And without this policy, the consequences in their everyday life might actually be worsened. For example, that person might need to earn their wages and use their car to go to work. Or maybe they live in rural areas and they need the car to even get their groceries. So this is a great alternative for those who really need their license. On the one hand, it makes sure that we don't have people who are drunk and driving on the roads, but on the other, if the person is capable and feels enabled, it gives them that possibility to use their cars without endangering others. However, it does come at a cost, and it will be relatively more expensive for those who can't afford it. Can you explain to me why you or the department and your team were interested in answering this question?
The fact that it's a user pays kind of penalty is very unique in the criminal justice system. Other than fines, there's not a whole lot of other penalties or punishments in the criminal justice system where you have this private payment. And also there's a bit of kind of incentives going on there, right? Because we're trying to incentivize people to take up this device by making the alternative, if they don't install it, quite a lengthy disqualification. 5 years is a really, really long time. So that's interesting as well. As part of this work, we also did some other work looking into predicting who's likely to install the device. So there's all these interesting little facets of this study. I also think that technological solutions to crime are also very interesting. I think when people think about reducing crime, they often think of rehabilitation programs that are trying to change behavior, but technology can be a really effective way of crime prevention. And so this is another aspect of this policy which makes it interesting to study. And of course there's the multi-agency aspects of it as well, that the criminal justice system could possibly benefit, but also our colleagues in Transport for New South Wales had some interest in understanding whether this was making people drive more safely, whether it was in terms of infringements or crashes. So it was just a really good opportunity to bring both agencies together to look at this.
In terms of incentives, the option of being able to choose between the device or not can then cater for two different types of people. And before, you didn't even have that option. So let's imagine that you're a young uni student who just got a new car for his or your birthday. And unfortunately, you go out and drink and get caught driving over the limit. In this case, maybe this student or you are okay without driving for a while because you can take public transport to go to uni, or maybe your parents are extremely nice and can drive you. In any case, you do have an alternative to driving and your life doesn't necessarily depend on it. So it's a bit like I have learned my lesson type of a scenario in a sense. And then you move on with your life. But if you're a single parent, for example, who relies on the car to go to work, you live in a rural area and have no other means to transport around, you also don't have help from extended family, then maybe you have made the same mistake, but the consequences are way larger than for the uni student. And it becomes more of a problematic situation in which you might be already disadvantaged, and now without the license, you are struggling even more. So basically, the interlock might suit some people depending on what they need the car for, how much do they rely on the car, how much they might have to be taking care of others and using the car to do so, and what the alternatives are. So in any case, having that option of the interlock is better off than not having that possible option. But it's important to note that the policy is not perfect and that the interlock system has actually to be paid by the offender. And that cost will depend on elements such as the age and model of the car or the type of ignition. As an example, if you have a 10-year-old standard car that starts with a key, you could pay approximately between $1,500 and $2,000 a year for the installation and the renting of the device. Now, of course, $2,000 a year will be relatively more costly the poorer you are. But still, you will have an option to go for the standard punishment or possibly installing the device, which was not available prior to the implementation of this policy. Tell me exactly how did you use data, and which data you used to answer these questions?
We took our data, which is relating to drink driving offenses, and we linked it to their information. And they gave us a lot of data. They had data on who installed the devices, they had data on crashes, they had data on infringements. So we were able to piece together a data set for everyone who had any drink driving offense, whether it was eligible for the program or not, across New South Wales, from before the program even started to about 3 years after, when the next iteration came in. And we had for these people not only information on their demographics, their criminal history, their license status, whether they installed the device, and further drink driving, whether they had involved any crashes, whether they had done any driving while disqualified. So we had a really big, detailed data set, which is the dream when you're a public policy researcher. And so what we could do in the paper, we used two methods, but I'll just talk about one of them. And it's really special because we very, very rarely get a chance to use this method, is we could use something called a regression discontinuity design. So under this program, if you're a first-time offender, you're only eligible if you're detected driving at what we call the high range drink driving, which is when your blood alcohol concentration is 0.15 or higher. So blood alcohol concentration is just the measure of how much alcohol there is in your blood when you're tested for drink driving. And so this enables the kind of use of that method. And the intuition is, if you think about someone who's just having casual couple of drinks and is caught drink driving versus someone who's quite a heavy drinker, engaging in risky drinking, and then has made the decision to drive, those two individuals are likely to vary quite significantly in their likelihood of committing another drink driving, right? If someone's got a serious dependence on alcohol, they're much more likely to drink drive again in the future compared to your sort of average casual drinker who might have just overestimated the number of wines they had at dinner, for example. So what a regression discontinuity design does is, if you have a continuous measure like the blood alcohol concentration, where you could have a reading of 0.51, 0.49, we can really narrow down the people that we are looking at to a small group on either side of that high range threshold who are much more likely to be similar. And within that threshold, you could even argue that being over that eligibility cutoff is almost random, right? Because, if you and I, for example, both drank the same amount and started driving, the blood alcohol concentration readings would depend on how quickly we were consuming alcohol, at what point along in our journeys we were breath tested. And so we can almost consider, by cutting our sample down to this small range on either side of that cutoff, we kind of get almost an experiment. So that's what we did. And I guess the other thing that we can do is we can even consider the effects for the proportion that installed the device. Effectively, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, so we're looking at people who were just above the eligibility cutoff. What was their likelihood of drink driving? And then we look at the people who just missed out, who were just below. What was their probability of repeat drink driving? And then we can compare those numbers and come up with what that difference was. So what we found is that for the people in that narrow range, right above the threshold, compared to those people just below, they were 6 percentage points less likely to commit a further drink driving offense in the period that the device was installed. It was supposed to be installed. And 6 percentage points means, like, for example, a reduction from 46% to 40%. Not that it's that high at all, actually, if you read the paper. And when we use a fuzzy regression discontinuity, which is when we consider the effects only for the proportion that install, what we find is an 11 percentage point effect, which is, again, kind of reducing them from, frankly, about 12% getting caught for drink driving in that period to about 1%. It is an 86% reduction, which is huge.
Let's imagine for a second that we're twins and we decide to go out one night, have a couple of drinks, the same amount and type of drinks, so we drink exactly the same, and drive back home in separate cars. And you just happen to be driving just ahead of me. And driving back, we get busted. We have to stop for a breath test. And because you're ahead of me, you do that first. But for both of us, our alcohol content needs to be 0.049 and below to be really off the hook. Only because you are driving ahead of me, the police stops you first. And guess what? Blow right above the threshold at 0.05 and you will receive a penalty. Now, I get lucky because I get tested 10 minutes later while you are getting tested, and I get a reading of 0.049. And I'm like, yay, I didn't get caught. And I just move with my life. I don't have to be given the choice to either get a 5-year suspension of my license or install that device in my car. But you do. And this is an example of a hypothetical experiment. Remember, we are twins. So we are genetically identical and we have drunk exactly the same, but you were unlucky. And this is a bit like a lottery. You just got caught and grounded and I'm off the hook because while I waited for my turn, my body had time to metabolize the alcohol. Now, the key question is, does this experiment change the probability that you get caught again drink driving in the future? Are you going to be more or less likely to drink drive again and therefore be caught after this happens, after you have actually served your sentence? And with that sentence, I mean either getting your driving license suspended or having the interlock. Now, let's say you get the interlock and you have it for as long as you have been required to do so. And once that interlock device has been removed and you are again technically free to drink and drive again, let's see what happens. In 2 years, for example, you and I go out again and we drink or not. And the question is, despite being twins, will your behavior change from now on? Are you going to be more likely to either ask me for a ride back and not even drive your car to have a drink, or not drink because you had the experience of an interlock? Has it made you, and only you, not me, more aware and conscious about not repeating that mistake? And this is exactly what you're measuring, right? So you are basically assuming that people who are just below and above that threshold of alcohol in their blood are similar enough to be compared as if they were twins. And in a more general way, the question is, does the likelihood of being caught drink driving again change among those type of people? And what you find is that the interlock does not actually work among those who are unlucky and choose to use it, but it does have a large effect. And it makes sense, right? Because it's a big cost to pay, not only to install the device, but also everything that comes with it, such as even shame and limited freedom.
In the paper, we can actually, because we have this rich data set, we can actually test the similarity of the people we're comparing. Just, are they similar? Is there anything else that changes at that cutoff? And we find that generally there's not much. That the groups that we're comparing, they're very, very similar. So that gives us extra confidence in this analysis that we've done.
Yes, exactly. So, in an ideal world, just for the sake of the example, we would like you and I to be twins. If we had lots of pairs of twins and some will get over and under the threshold, then it'd be easy to understand why we could measure this question. However, in reality, this is obviously not possible. But we can do a second best. Researchers can extract the data, obviously with a lot of permissions, from those driving licenses that you get when you commit an offense, such as age, gender, whether the person lives in a rural or urban area. And you can even link that postal information to a range of socioeconomic characteristics that are related to the income in that area or poverty. So you can draw a little bit of a picture of how does that person look like and try to match it to someone who could be like a potential twin. This allows us to compare sets of fake twins. That is, people with the same age, the same gender, living in a similar area to each other. And the only difference between these two groups of, let's say, fake twins is that one got the interlock device and the other one did not get caught. This allows us to confidently argue that any change in behavior in the future related to drink driving is only because one got caught and chose the interlock and the other didn't. Anyways, my students know that I always get carried away when talking about this stuff. But for those listening, we tend to use fancy words when describing methods that try to mimic those twin experiments. And in this report, the way that you use the data, we would describe it using the keywords discontinuity and jump. So basically, similar people who have drank the same amount get tested at different times, like in our example, or sometimes maybe the breathalyzer can have some testing errors. And this mistake creates a jump. It separates our paths in terms of the consequence faced. It creates a discontinuity in our life. And just for the very, very nerds among us, the fuzzy part means that for those who have an option to take the interlock or not, only those who take the interlock are the ones who are going to be looked at. But again, this is just for the very nerds out there. Now, we have discussed the specifics of the report, and now I'd like to wrap up with a bit of reflection on your experiences with data. How do you think that the data has been useful in your everyday life?
Yeah, data is invaluable. I mean, I can't say that I ever, in my everyday life, conduct data analysis to the extent that I would in my job. But if you think about it, we're kind of doing it subtly when we do things like we look at properties to buy or rent. We're subconsciously thinking about, is this reasonable based on some metric of averages or medians that we've computed in our minds. And I think about data also in subtle ways in our everyday life. Technological improvements, public safety improvements, whether that's through regulation or medicine or crime reduction, all of that would not be possible without data.
I can tell your answer comes from someone who really loves data and embraces it. So let's dig a bit more on how this affects your everyday life. Can you think about an example of anything you've read on the news or a politician has said that you thought at the moment that data could reassure you that you're not being fooled by that statement? Or does your knowledge of data make you more hesitant and skeptical about all that information that you consume?
People are always very concerned about some of the decisions that are made in criminal justice system. Who's going to offend when they're out on bail? Who's going to commit another domestic violence offense? And so you'll see that in our public discourse, there's a lot of debate about what factors are actually most correlated with this. What people are really looking to understand, almost magic factors that will help us deal with this problem, right? Is it that, when a woman is pregnant, or is it when the partners have just broken up? It's interesting because I think as a data person, you can see the setup of how would we set up a study to actually look at this, right? So you see people talking in words, debating questions about policy, and you can see how you can use data to actually help inform these debates.
So I guess it makes you more cautious and analytical about the information you're being fed. And you can also picture how would you go about answering that question. So in thinking about this research project, what was the most challenging obstacle that you faced?
So I don't know if this is just because I've never had such a rich data set before. Firstly, speaking of the data set, it was significant effort to put it together. We had to prepare random of understanding between us and transport to get the data. And then it was a lot of work for our programmers to actually put the tables together so that I could then use it. And then, the sheer volume of work you can do when you have a data set like this into testing how valid the analysis is, looking at the impacts on different groups, and, seeing if your assumptions hold. It's quite a mammoth effort. And I think when you have a lot of data, of course, there's a lot of things you can do, but not everything you do is necessarily relevant for policy. So when you're done, producing all these tables, all these statistics, all these charts, you then have to almost package it up in a way that's digestible, that makes sense, that's relevant for the policy audiences that you're trying to influence and inform. And so, in a way, it's about picking and choosing messages and balancing being thorough, being timely, being a good communicator. And so in the early days when I was presenting this work to different groups, I would almost go overboard in explaining the technical detail to people, especially because there was another method that I used in the paper. But I realized it was actually more important to frame the policy problems, like we talked about today, kind of that what interlocks are doing relative to other penalties that we've previously used, and really explain the key parts of the study that help shed light on that question, rather than just kind of talking about everything we did in the data, which of course, as data people, we love, but the people receiving the information, it doesn't always resonate with them.
You have touched on something that is worth highlighting, and especially to those listeners who might be put off by data and think that it's just mathematics. They don't even know why they're listening. There is actually a narrative behind the data, and it's just more than numbers. So one data set can tell us multiple stories, depending on how the data is used. Sometimes we cannot even find a story. But in finding these narratives, it's just a bit of a process of trial and error. So you search, you research, and then, the narrative might change. And that's not necessarily data mining or data manipulating or unethical, but you have to kind of be patient, be knowledgeable with the data, and kind of let the data talk to you. And after you've done that, you also need to find a proper way to communicate that to others, see who your audience is. And that translation can be done in many ways. So my follow-up question is, in your experience dealing with big data sets, with substantial amounts of information that can be overwhelming, what do you wish you would have known in order to effectively synthesize and transmit the data's narrative to your audience?
What I wish I had done is thought a little bit more about how the different bits of data analysis contribute to different questions about the policy in the program. Right. So there are things now that when I think about the paper, I would have tried to frame it more clearly if I had asked more incisive questions about policy. So, for example, what's the optimal target population? When I'm examining effects for different groups, for example, what does that tell us about which groups we should try to encourage to install the devices because it might have the greatest impact? I think at the time I didn't always think about it because you're just like, especially from data background, you do this, you do this, you do this. People do this when they analyze this type of data or they use this type of method. So I think it's really important to link it back to policy actions. If you have especially when you have a successful program, what refinements can they make, and what types of analysis can help inform a refinement? Like, sometimes the refinements people can make in policy are expanding a policy or targeting it, offering better financial support, for example. I think is something that I could have held on more strongly in that process. It could have helped me deal with the overwhelming volume of that data.
Well, I read your report and it was very clear. And I actually particularly love the fact that you had 3 questions very well stated about what were your research questions, and very well written. So I guess as someone who deals with data, and data can always, it opens more questions. So you probably just close the report because you had a deadline, you had to finish it, but there's always like an afterthought, something that's open. So what was then, on the other side, what was the most rewarding aspect of this research that you did?
If you've worked with any data sets before and databases, it's a lot of work to maintain them, build them, compile the data. So in a way, when you get the data, I felt so lucky to be able to take what I know is a lot of hard work from a lot of people for many years and actually turn that into a product that people find interesting, that people find useful. And so it's very, very rewarding. And I've received a lot of positive feedback about it being a great example of data sharing between government agencies, it being an example of good practice in evaluation. And of course, the regression is continuity. We don't get a whole lot of opportunities to use it. Being able to do not just the evaluation, but that other piece of work around who's installing the devices, I think helped us contribute towards a really more holistic kind of evaluation that's not just about effectiveness. It's also looking a little bit more into how the policy is working under the hood. Transport also commissioned some qualitative work with the participants. They did a study where they interviewed people and found out what was good about it, what was bad about it. And they then took all the findings from the different pieces of work and put it into this big report. And it's just great to read because in many ways you want our public policy should be evaluated in ways that are really comprehensive, that look at the problem from different angles, and that use really rigorous data analysis. A great thing to be part of.
I agree. And your report really shows the gold standard of how policies should be analyzed by government agencies and communicated to others. So you managed to get the data holders to agree to share the data safely and to collaborate among each other to merge that data, as well as asking a question that is relevant to people, policymakers, politicians, and to the decision makers. And the way that the policy was implemented allow you to answer your question in a convincing way for the nerds and then write it in a way that everyone can understand. And it is very important to remember that data reports and analysis are great, and being able to measure the impact on reoffending probability is great, but we do not want to forget that these policies affecting people in other aspects of their life. And those aspects are also relevant for policy, even though we might not have the data to measure it. I mean, putting together qualitative and quantitative data in a way that is convincing for everyone is quite a big accomplishment. And I'm sure that you're going to do great in your master's at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm really looking forward for you to teaching me more about the policies you will analyze in the future when you finish. It was a real pleasure to have you here today, Sara. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge and insights about data.
Thanks for having me on the podcast.
And thank you, of course, to all those who listen to this podcast episode. Tune in to the next episode of Embracing Data.